You were never supposed to notice it. That's the part they didn't account for. Not your strength, not your patience, not your silence, but the fact that you would eventually see through it. At first, it didn't look like anything important. Just small moments. A tone that shifted when you spoke. A pause that lasted half a second too long. The way certain people smiled at you like they had already decided who you were, without ever asking. And you let it pass. Because that's what you do when you're still gathering information. But something changed. Not loudly, not dramatically. No cinematic collapse of reality. Just a quiet internal click, like a door inside your mind, finally locking into place. You started noticing patterns where others only saw coincidence. Who supported you when it cost them nothing? And who disappeared the moment it did? Who listened to understand you, and who listened only to respond? Who looked at you like you were temporary? And that's when it hit you. You were never actually unknown. You were just misread on purpose. Because it was easier for them that way. Easier to underestimate you than to measure you correctly. Easier to assume you were passive than to accept you were observant. Easier to believe you were silent because you had nothing to say than to consider you were silent because you were deciding when to speak. And now that realization sits in your mind like a weight that doesn't crush you. It clarifies you. You start replaying everything. Every conversation that felt slightly off. Every moment someone interrupted you too quickly. Every time your presence was treated like background noise in a room you were fully aware of. And suddenly, it's all visible. Not new. Just revealed. That's the uncomfortable part. Nothing changed. Except your ability to ignore it. And now there's a strange stillness inside you. Not confusion, not anger, something colder. More precise. Like your attention has finally stopped leaking into places that never deserved it. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You were never meant to see this. But now you did. And everything that follows has to adjust to that fact. They made one quiet assumption about you, and everything else was built on top of it. That you were easy to read. That your calm meant absence of depth. That your silence meant agreement. That your restraint meant you didn't notice. So they kept talking, like you weren't tracking every layer beneath their words. They interrupted you because they thought you would return to your place. They dismissed your ideas because they assumed you would refine them for their approval later. They spoke over you because they believed your presence was something that could be overwritten. And you let them. Not because you couldn't stop it, but because you were learning something they never considered. People reveal themselves faster when they think they are safe. So you stayed quiet. Not empty. Not passive. Just observant in a way they mistook for distance. And in that misunderstanding, they built a version of you that was convenient for them. Harmless. Predictable. Replaceable. They labeled your patience as lack of urgency. Your forgiveness as lack of boundaries. Your composure as lack of reaction. But none of that was true. What they called not reacting was actually you recording everything without interruption. What they called being fine was you deciding what deserved your energy and what didn't. What they called soft was you refusing to waste force on things that didn't require it. The irony is they felt powerful around you because you never competed for dominance in their language. You didn't need to. Because while they were busy trying to rank you, you were already understanding them. Not emotionally, not personally, structurally. You started to see how quickly they rely on attention, how easily they confuse noise with importance, how often they mistake being seen for being significant. And still, they thought you were the one missing something. That's the part that will always come back to them too late. Because when someone misreads you long enough, they don't just misunderstand you. They start interacting with a version of you that never existed. And that version was never real enough to defend itself. So you didn't correct them. You didn't argue. You let the misunderstanding grow until it became evidence. And now that you've seen it clearly, you realize something else. They weren't reacting to you. They were reacting to their assumption of you. And assumptions collapse the moment reality stops accommodating them, which means what they thought was stability was only temporary permission, and you were the one giving it to them, until you weren't. And that shift, the moment you stopped participating in their version of you, is where everything begins to break. What they never understood is that your silence wasn't empty space. It was structure. While they filled rooms with opinions, reactions, performances, you were mapping something else entirely. You were watching what stayed consistent when people weren't trying to impress anyone. You were noticing what remained when attention wasn't being chased. And that's where the truth always hides. Because people don't reveal themselves in their strongest moments. They reveal themselves in their automatic ones. The way they treat someone they think they don't need. The way they speak when there's no benefit to being polite. The way they shift energy the moment they believe they have control. You saw all of it. But you didn't interfere. That's what made them comfortable. And also what made them careless. They thought your quiet meant you weren't processing. In reality, you were processing everything, just without giving them feedback. No correction, no resistance, no emotional signal to adjust their behavior. So they kept going, deeper, louder, more exposed, until they showed you exactly what they were underneath the performance. And what you found there wasn't surprising. It was consistent. People rarely change when unobserved. They reveal continuity. That's what you were studying. Not words, not intentions, but patterns that repeat when no one is correcting them. And slowly, without announcing it to anyone, you stopped seeing them as individuals and started seeing them as systems. Predictable ones. Some needed validation to stay stable. Some needed superiority to feel secure. Some needed your silence so they could mistake it for agreement. And once you understood that, something inside you shifted. Because you were never part of their performance. You were the audience they didn't realize was real. And that changes the meaning of everything you experienced. The disrespect wasn't confusion. It was assumption. The overlooking wasn't accidental, it was convenient. The misreading wasn't ignorance, it was preference. They preferred you smaller. Because a smaller version of you was easier to place inside their world without adjusting it. But beneath all of that, something else was happening that they never detected. You were gradually becoming unreachable in the exact same places they thought they had access to you. Emotionally, mentally, structurally. And they didn't notice the withdrawal. Because you never announced the entry. Which means they also won't notice the exit. Not until it's already complete. And by the time they realize what they were actually interacting with, the version of you they built their assumptions on will already be gone. It didn't happen the way they imagined turning points happen. No confrontation. No dramatic exit. No final speech that makes everyone stop and rethink their life. It happened quieter than that. Almost unnoticeable, unless you were the one living it. There was a moment where something inside you simply stopped negotiating, not with them, with the situation. Because you realized you had been over-participating in things that never required your full presence. Explaining yourself to people who had already decided not to understand. staying slightly longer in spaces that only valued you when it was convenient, giving second chances that were never actually being used for change. And one day, it just felt unnecessary. That's the word that changed everything. Unnecessary. Not painful, not dramatic, just unnecessary. That's when the shift began. You didn't pull away emotionally first, you pulled away internally. Your attention stopped rushing toward people who never held it carefully. Your energy stopped responding on demand. Your presence stopped arriving fully where it wasn't met fully in return. And strangely, no one noticed immediately. Because you were still there, still responding, still showing up, still playing the role they were used to. But something fundamental had changed. You were no longer emotionally available inside your own actions. And that's where the real separation begins. Not in distance, but in disconnection. They kept interacting with you like nothing had shifted, because from their perspective, nothing obvious had changed. But you knew, because for the first time, you weren't seeking understanding from people who had already proven they weren't offering it. You weren't trying to correct their perception anymore. You weren't trying to stabilize misunderstandings. You weren't trying to stay emotionally legible in their eyes. And without realizing it, that made you unpredictable. Not louder, not colder, just no longer accessible in the way they assumed you would always be. That's what they missed. They thought the connection was being tested from their side, but the test had already happened on yours, and you had already passed by stepping out of the need to be understood by them. Which means the version of you they relied on wasn't disappearing suddenly. It was already gone. They were just late to notice. And that delay is where their confusion begins to turn into something else entirely. At first, they don't even recognize what's happening. It doesn't feel like loss. It feels like confusion. You're still there, technically. Still reachable. Still visible in the same spaces. But something about you no longer responds in the same rhythm they're used to. And that's where the discomfort begins. Because people don't panic when you leave loudly. They panic when you stay. Differently. They replay old interactions trying to find the exact moment things changed, as if there was a single scene where everything broke. But there wasn't. Nothing broke. You simply stopped feeding what was never reciprocal. And now their access to you feels inconsistent. Sometimes you respond, but without urgency. Sometimes you listen, but without absorption. Sometimes you're present, but not emotionally traceable. And that unpredictability starts to do something to them. At first, they assume it's temporary. A mood. A phase. Something they can reset with the right words or timing. So they try. They reach out more casually at first, like nothing has shifted. Then slightly more carefully. Then with a subtle edge of concern they don't fully admit. But every attempt lands on the same realization. You are no longer arriving in the same way. And that's when panic stops being subtle. Because what they thought was stability was actually dependency on your consistency. Your patience made them careless. Your availability made them comfortable. Your silence made them confident. And now that all of those things are no longer being offered freely, they don't know how to recalibrate. So they start overthinking everything. Every past interaction becomes evidence. Every word they dismiss now feels important. Every moment they took you lightly replays with uncomfortable clarity. And beneath all of it, one realization keeps rising, even if they don't say it out loud. They didn't lose you in a moment. They lost access to you the moment you stopped needing them to understand your value. That's when regret begins to set in. Not as emotion, but as recognition they can't undo. And the worst part for them isn't that you changed. It's that you didn't need to announce it, because by the time they started noticing the absence, you had already stopped being reachable in the way they thought was permanent. And now they're left interacting with silence that used to respond. You don't become distant all at once. It happens in layers, so subtle that even you don't fully notice the moment you cross over. First, it's your patience that changes. You stop explaining things twice. Then it's your emotional availability. You no longer extend it to people who only learned how to receive it, not protect it. Then something deeper shifts. You stop interpreting disrespect as misunderstanding. That's the real turning point. Because once you stop giving people the benefit of confusion, their behavior becomes what it actually is. Not accidental, not unaware, but chosen. And from that point forward, your standards stop being flexible. Not loudly, not aggressively. There's no announcement, no declaration, no need for one. You simply stop adjusting yourself to fit into spaces that require you to shrink. And that changes everything. People who were used to your adaptability start feeling your absence in real time, even when you're physically present. Because you're no longer compensating, no longer smoothing over tension, no longer translating your own boundaries into something easier for others to digest. You become precise, selective, economical with your energy. And strangely, that quiet discipline reads as distance to people who were benefiting from your lack of it. But you're not moving away from them emotionally out of reaction. You're moving inward out of recognition. Recognition that not every connection deserves access to your full presence. Recognition that understanding someone is not the same as continuing to entertain them. Recognition that your energy was never meant to be distributed equally, only intentionally. So you start choosing differently. Not based on history, not based on familiarity, not based on what someone used to be in your life, but based on what they consistently prove themselves to be now. And in that shift, something irreversible happens. You stop seeking closure from people who operate without reflection. You stop waiting for accountability from people who benefit from ambiguity. You stop expecting depth from those who only engage at surface level. And what's left is not bitterness. It's clarity so clean it feels like distance. Because you're no longer trying to be understood by everyone. You're only remaining accessible to what actually deserves your attention. And that alone changes the entire structure of how people experience you, including the ones who thought you would always stay the same. In the end, they don't really get a final version of you. They only get the memory of one. The version that tolerated confusion longer than it should have. The version that answered when it didn't need to. The version that stayed emotionally reachable in places that never protected that access. That version is what they keep referencing, as if it still exists somewhere they can return to. But it doesn't. What exists now is something quieter and far more final. You are no longer reacting to people. You are observing them. You are no longer trying to be understood in real time. You are only allowing understanding where it naturally arrives. And that changes your entire presence without you needing to announce a single thing. Because when someone stops over-explaining themselves, the world is forced to meet them at their actual depth, not the simplified version others got comfortable with. That's where the shift becomes irreversible. People begin to feel it before they can name it. The conversations feel shorter. The access feels narrower. The emotional leverage they once had stops working. Not because you became colder, but because you stopped offering unnecessary warmth to places that never learned how to hold it. And in that absence, something uncomfortable forms in them. Not hatred, not even anger. Recognition. The realization that they were never dealing with someone who lacked depth, They were dealing with someone who chose when to reveal it. And now that choice is no longer in their favor. Because you are not proving anything anymore. You are not correcting narratives. You are not chasing understanding. You are not revisiting people who required you to shrink in order to be accepted. You are simply continuing forward with a level of internal clarity that makes old versions of your life feel almost fictional. And from the outside, they will call it change. But it isn't change. It's exposure. The exposure of what happens when someone finally stops participating in dynamics that were never built on mutual recognition. And by the time they fully understand what they had access to, you are already too far removed from the version of you they were familiar with. Not gone, just no longer reachable from where they are standing.